We have one of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. In my youth, I was an athlete, a middle distance runner, and I spent a lot of my time running over the landscape for training, and I did a lot of cross-country racing too, around for Yorkshire and north of England and stuff like that. I was even shortlisted for the Rome Olympics at 5 and 10,000 metres. So I worked hard in my running, and I became very familiar with the landscape, the lie of the land, the flow of it. And this particular kind of landscape was great to run over. There's something very special about these hills in that nowhere is very far. You can look across these hills without much trouble and say, right, 15, 20, 30 minutes, someday I'll be over there. On a Sunday morning I'd do a 20-mile run. Well, 20 miles will take you a fair amount across these hills here. What excites me often isn't those things that separate the landscape, from trees and hedges and things like that, and little details. It's the general flow, the mass of its feeling overall, and then the way the light affects it, and the dark, and the colour and so on. So I'm thinking on large scales all the time. My landscape is a mixture of what I see and what I feel. And I know if my paintings hover somewhere between what we call reality and abstraction, it's a territory that enables me to express more of me in it. Maybe what you might call poetry, really, a lyricism, which you can't sort of access if you end up painting every detail at least I can't access every detail of a branch or leaf or blade of grass and so on, every cow in a field. What I tend to do now is go out of doors and work directly in nature. And I'll work on paper. I'll sometimes prepare the paper. I used to work on things like the backs of envelopes, any old scrap of paper really to work on. But now I tend to work on a very heavy handmade paper. And even then I sometimes surface it with a kind of almost half-chalk ground, which is a mixture of dead plaster with an adhesive, and it gives almost like an eggshell surface. And I work with a combination of watercolour and pastel. And people say to me, "Oh, which do you put down first? Do you put the watercolour down then and work into pastel?" If I operate in that way, if I have a procedure, then I know I won't capture what it is I see. And what I let dictate is what I see. If what excites me has a dense body of colour which is vital to capture, I'll probably very, very rapidly work into pastel. And then choose sometimes a similar kind of colour in watercolour and work into that, and often very, very loosely. But what I try to do is replicate out there what I would do in here. And I work with pastel and watercolour because in a way I can get through that combination of those two media the same intensity of colour as I would get with the acrylics in here. And I often work very, very quickly, and I'll work on 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 or 5 studies of one specific view, just with maybe different passages of light and so on, maybe just shifting my position a little bit, so that when I come back I have several studies all based around the same sort of thing. They will be the sum of my experience. Often people look from the small studies to the large one and they don't see a copy. It will owe a lot to the subject source from which it springs. But as to being a direct copy as such, I hope it'll capture the spirit of the place. I hope it'll remind people of the place. Using paint very, very thinly, I run water into it, I'll work with it thickly, I'll let thin parts engage with thick. I'll sometimes tilt the canvas slightly so one runs into the other. So I'm looking as much as anything for what really excites me about a certain thing. I mean, it can be a hollow, it can be the line of a hill, the interrelationship sometimes between foreground and background. Sometimes you get some really exciting foreground textural things, and then everything flows back to a wonderful line in the distance. And I like that interplay, with that kind of dialogue between the background and the foreground. So I'll play on that. I'll do several studies. Sometimes I'll find that maybe even watercolour and pastel don't give me that. So I'll get out a piece of cane and some ink and draw into it with that. I never know what's going to be necessary to make changes. Sometimes I get it very nearly there and then virtually almost destroy it and rework into it. If I start getting precious or very tight or over-concerned about a little detail here or there, I know I'm losing the spirit of what it is. I've got to go back to its broad, free, to a broad, free statement. You have got to toss around very large quantities of paint, and you've got to keep that texture interesting but simple. That's the big trick. And you think, oh look, all those big areas of dark colour and maybe another big area of light colour. Surely I'll have to put something in there to explain it away. Never yield to that temptation. Keep it big, because then you can come in and put a bit of additional information or imply detail further back, which then explains the massiveness of this in the foreground. It's easy when you've got a big canvas to fill it with all sorts of bits and pieces, but to keep its sense of scale, to keep its grandeur, to keep that the massiveness of it, you have to eliminate an awful lot of detail, and you've got to think big, and you've got to attack the painting when you're really up for it. A lot of folk have thought what I was doing was very abstract, because they wouldn't see a hedge or a cow or a sheep or a tree specifically. But before very long, once they've walked the landscape, they start to see how I use shapes to signify the presence of all sorts of things, like those things I've just mentioned. They are there, in a sense, by implication, by the kind of marks that you find in the canvas. And you can walk through the canvases. You can plot your path right to the horizon virtually. And you can wander through these fields and through between what look like trees, might be trees, because you, the viewer, is engaged in it. It's the viewer that shapes it. It's the viewer's experience of landscape that shapes it, and the correspondence between the viewer and the painting.